In this course, we've been safely able to ignore anything that comes before the root element inside of an XML file. And I designed it that way. I don't really want you to get too tied up in what I consider to be more nuance and more mechanics than semantics. Things that go from the root node down through your instance, they all matter in terms of the model. They all matter in terms of the semantics. Things that precede that root node, which are called the prelude, are actually not about the semantics of the, by and large, not about the semantics of the information in the instance. Really, they're more about the mechanics of processing that instance and how to hook it up together. So we've kind of ignored those. Where necessary, I've given you that prelude. But now I at least want to expose you to it, and I want to get you started, and eventually you kind of have to come to grips with it anyway, so let me at least introduce it to you. So I have an example here in this topic of various things that could show up in a prelude, starting with the one that almost always shows up in the prelude, and in fact it's kind of a strong recommendation that it show up in the prelude. And it's called a processing instruction, and the processing instruction starts with that angle bracket question mark, showing that it's a processing instruction. And basically it's a generic or standard processing instruction that says, in effect, I'm XML, here's my version, and here's the encoding scheme that I use to represent my characters. So any application that opens this file can look at that very first line and say, oh, I see what's going on. This is XML version 1.0, and it's encoded using UTF-8. Okay, so I'll let you look further and read a little bit in the topic about what UTF means and what the other encoding standards are. Right now, what I really want to impress upon you is that that's just an instruction, and it says, hey, whoever's opening up this file, this is the kind of file that I am. It's basically identifying the file. And that's the only really standard processing instruction that exists. Down from that, I'll talk a little bit about these sort of what I call semi-standard processing instructions. In other words, there's no demand that you use these, but they're commonly used, and you'll see them a lot, and they're actually useful for you to know about and to be able to have at your disposal. And so they're the ones that say XML-style sheet, and these are all about, now, unfortunately, the word style sheet here really shows you the confusion that we have between XSL and CSS. Both of them are style sheets. And so they both use this XSL processing command called XSL style sheet to define them. So the difference is that they have different types. One is text/CSS, the other is text/XSL. So rather than going into the philosophy of style sheets and why they're named style sheets, etc., let me just give you a very practical blush on this concept. And that is that if you want to associate a style sheet, either a CSS style sheet or an XSL style sheet with this instance, these are the commands that do it. And they do it in a very straightforward way. You say, I want a style sheet associated with this instance. Here's the kind of style sheet it is, a CSS or an XSL style sheet, and here's where it is. That href attribute defines where it is. And you can see in this case that it's defined with a relative path. So relative to what? Relative to this XML document, here's where that style sheet is. Whatever folder the XML document is, go up one, then go down into CSS, and you'll see this style sheet. Go up one, go down into XSL, and you'll see this style sheet. These are the style sheets that are associated with this instance. Okay, and so you've now declared that, you've stated that, and it's up to the application that opens the file to do something about it. If you happen to be opening this file in Oxygen or some other XML IDE, generally speaking, it will read these and it'll do the right thing. When you click the little transform button, it knows what transform to use because you specified it up front here. If there's some sort of authoring user interface that applies styles to the tags based on CSS, a common thing to do in XML IDEs, that you have a CSS file and it says how not to display HTML tags now, but to display XML tags. You put in your little rules in your CSS for the XML tags, and it'll display them according to those, bold or italic or whatever you say, spacing, borders, whatever. It'll read that CSS file and it'll know which CSS file to use in order to define the formatting of the instance. Okay, so those two, the ones on lines 3 and 4, declare that this is my CSS file, this is my XSL file, so that applications can use that to your advantage. Then I've included a couple of custom tags, ones that you can invent if you happen to be someone who is writing a program that's going to open up XML files and try to do something with them. You can pass your own custom parameters. So I've included one that's kind of an Oxygen parameter, right? So, and then another one that's a Bob app, obviously custom, right? I just invented that, and it's going to pass this parameter, And the parameter is whatever I want it to be, whatever my program will recognize, named however I want it to be named, with the value that I want it to have, to pass parameters into the program that opens this XML file so that it can be parsed. Okay, so that's really actually what's happening in all of them. There's a message that says, what kind of processing instruction am I? Who am I an instruction to? And then it's followed by a set of parameters that are, and here's what this instruction is about. So that's the idea of processing instructions. The doc type, really not much to say about the doc type, except that it's a way of specifying a DTD instead of a schema. We've used on the root node, do I have it here? Yes, we do. On the root node, I have something called no namespace schema location, and that's what we've been using to define our schema. But an alternative way to do it is to say doc type using this syntax, and I'll let you figure out the syntax if you need to, that says here's the DTD that rules me. Now remember, DTDs and schemas are really two methods of doing the same thing. So in reality, we wouldn't define a DTD and a schema as I've done here, but I wanted to show you the contrast in here. Okay, so type number 2 is the doc type, and that doc type allows you to define a DTD instead of a schema that's going to rule the content inside of this XML document. And then the final thing I want to introduce you to is this idea of a CDDATA section. So the CDDATA section uses yet another variation. Notice various variations on that idea of angle brackets that are different kinds of angle brackets, you might call them, different kinds of tags. This tag says, you know, between the opening of the CDDATA and the closing of the CDDATA, don't parse this. It's like a no parse zone. Don't parse anything in here. I'm sticking a bunch of stuff in here that isn't really XML, and I don't want you to think of it as XML. So it's a way of putting brackets around stuff that's not XML. Two of the main reasons to use that, the first one is to put binary information inside of your instance. So I want to store a binary file, like for example an image file, right inside my instance, and that's not XML by any stretch, and so I will put a CDDATA around it to say that that should not be looked at. Another thing that's very commonly done with that CDDATA section, you'll see it all the time, is I have messed up HTML. It's not well formed by any stretch, but I still want to store it inside my XML file, and so I put a CDDATA section around it so that all the screwed up syntax doesn't make the XML parser barf. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff about the prelude to the XML file, as well as this idea of the CDDATA section that should get you started on those trails should you need to use them. But as I say, in this class, there's really, you can just use what I give you in those places, and everything should turn out just fine.